This is Zero Signal, where security leaders stop waiting for certainty and start leading through it. I'm Conor Sherman.
And I'm Stuart Mitchell.
Let's get into it. Zero Signal is brought to you by Sysdig. Threat actors are compromising cloud accounts in under 8 minutes. Vulnerabilities are being exploited within 10 hours of disclosure. That's the defender's window, and it keeps closing. Attackers aren't waiting on dashboards. They go straight for what's running. Real time is the only timeline that matters. And that's why Forrester named Sysdig a leader in its latest wave for the cloud-native application protection platforms. Runtime is where real risk shows up, and runtime is what Sysdig is built for. So stop watching and start defending. Learn more at sysdig.com and check out the link in the description. Today on Zero Signal, we're speaking with Cheryl Martin, the executive for the cybersecurity at C86, formerly the vice president and head of cybersecurity of Capgemini in the UK, where she led 350 plus cyber specialists across regulated sectors. She is recognized in the 2026 Most Inspiring Women in Cyber Award and is a reoccurring voice at the International Cyber Expo on cyber leadership in technical environments. Today, we're going to be diving into the CISO who says no is toast. You were made an expert in 5 minutes and how AI is shifting this landscape for us security leaders and how to do leading transformation without becoming the bottleneck so that you as a security leader can step into your AI transformations with an operating model that turns shadow adoption into governed enablement, name exactly what scares you with your judgment and the tooling, and lead the change without being the friction point as the business makes its changes around you. So, Cheryl, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. Wow, what a tall order.
So I really wanted to start this as we were prepping for this conversation. There was something that was really important to me that jumped out with you, which is we are in the midst of incredible technological transformation across every enterprise. And we were talking about the role of the CISO in this moment. And I wanted to lean in on your time as being what you've learned and the experiences you've got from that operating model from your time at where you're the global head of IT risk at HSBC, where there were like 45 different global businesses, which means there were 45 different appetites and opinions. And you had this really cool adage that came out which was this idea of like how to do risk management at scale, which was like, if it looks like a duck and it's yellow and it's got spots and it's like, cool, we know you're going to be approved. But if it's purple and it's got pink spots, okay, then we need to circle back and like dive back into that. I just want to walk around. How do you navigate a world like this when you're dealing with enterprise scale, 45 different global businesses, 45 different appetites, risk postures all over the place? How do you, as a security leader, meet that moment?
Wow. Yes. And you're right. HSBC, for anyone who's spent any time with any large global bank will understand, has a lot of different postures, different countries it's working in. And where I came to when I first came in the role was, an 8 to 9 hour risk committee meeting, where every single, global business or global function came on. And you're right, smaller parts of the business will go, oh, this is really important to us. Larger parts of the business will go, this is really important to us. So what we did do is to look at risk from a perspective of what did it mean to the bank, but also what it might meant to some of those regional programs. So, for us as well, if we think about in this day and age, where we're looking at AI and certainly introduction of AI for many people. And Stuart, your recent LinkedIn post talked about, how you're using AI in your work. For many people, they are now into the same issue that I was as global head of IT risk for HSBC. Many organizations haven't got 45 global businesses or global functions. They've got 450.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to say, how am I bringing this down? And the duck analogy is exactly what we looked at, was what do we need as that basic level? We need a duck. We need to create a duck. We need to, trademark that duck. We need to say it needs to look like this, and this is how it's going to be. So if it was yellow and it quacked, it got a stamp of approval because it had the risk in there and the risk was understood and we accepted the risk and it was part of that risk program. But we just know that with the explosion of adoption of AI as well, that the duck is not going to look yellow because AI has built it to look yellow and purple and pink spots and
Yes.
various other things. So we've got to get to that point where we have that framework and that capability to still come back to say, what is it that I am happy within the organization to accept as a risk? Because you're absolutely right, Conor. What we can't have is everyone going, oh, but I want to put this in and I want to put that in, and security going, no, you can't. We're not going to do this. There are certain things, and I've got a couple of clients who have come to me and said, we're going to adopt Claude, but we're going to give it all of our capabilities. And some of them are in regulated organizations in the UK. And I'm going, yeah, hey, just, think about what it is that you need to do if you're adopting AI at scale.
It is kind of scary and probably not surprising to hear how many companies that we think highly of and think that so many wonderful minds sit behind of that are just like, hey, yeah, let's just put everything into Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT. And in your role, it must be so unique given you work for services, you take care of multiple clients, to see so many businesses that are at such different levels of adoption. Like, what are some of the common themes you see? Do you see that more businesses are entirely all in? Do you come across businesses that are at the opposite end that are utterly terrified to put anything in production because, hey, we need to be fully high, in line with our risk appetite. So what are some of the trends you see as you look at it across, now that you're not with HSBC, but you manage, I don't know how many clients they have in front of.
Let's put it out there.
Yeah.
I am not talking on behalf of HSBC, so that's really good. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that we are seeing so many different so many different views. We have got the CEO of certain organizations that say, if we don't adopt this, we're going to be left behind because our competitors are doing it. We need to look at it. But I still come back to that view of you need to understand what your risk is and what the risk of doing it or the risk of not doing it.
I really actually wanted you to unpack that for me for a second. I actually personally struggle with this a little bit. And I see this in my peer groups are also struggling with this because we're trying to arrive to this moment as these risk-oriented executives. And we're having conversations with growth-oriented members in the company, and they just see existential risk, right? They say, we will die tomorrow if we don't X. So nuance doesn't matter. And it's actually, from my seat, it's a very challenging, nuanced conversation you're trying to wrestle through. Do you have perspectives on, am I the only one? Is this happening in other places? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's what's happening. In boards across the world, that is absolutely what's happening. We've got some organizations who are absolutely frightened to use AI because of mythos and the things that are happening and what the implications could be. We've got other parts of the organizations and other, companies just embracing it because, there is this view. I think where we have to be, and we need to look at what it is for our own organization. And I think, Conor, this is where it comes back to that, what would I do in my own organization? What am I happy with accepting? What might have happened where we had, the explosion into digital and cloud and we saw data that was out in the web and doing things that we weren't aware of. How do we make sure we minimize that? Because we know that no sooner if we got through this AI explosion and using agentic AIs and, agents are either for good or for bad, we're going to have that quantum computing issue.
Right.
And, stuff that we thought that we knew the risk for today is going to be something very different when quantum is a reality. And we'll end up with the ability for quantum to break even more of that data that we have. So I think coming back into, what is it that we are prepared to accept as that risk within that organization? And as the CISO, we absolutely have moved away from being that, the CISO says no, to the CISO says, well, maybe, but what are the guardrails we need to put in place? So how are we adopting AI, or how are we adopting the agentic way of working with those guardrails is really critical and important. Now, what we can't stop is what we had in cloud, and what we had with, that explosion into cloud is some of those cottage industries which spring up in the organization. And that's the bit, when the board or the CISO or the risk manager or whoever says, no, you're not going to do it, you'll get that shadow IT, you'll get that shadow AI use. And that's where it becomes even more dangerous.
That may be the most elegant and polite way of talking about shadow AI I have ever heard in my life. These cottage industries, I'm like, it's so cute. I like, oh, wait. That's a really, really cool way of framing it. Thank you. Yeah. I was like, I will keep that for my next board update.
But that's the reality. What's happening? Okay, Cheryl's really big and ugly and she said no. Well, we're just going to wander down and we're going to do it at any rate.
100%. And I think, shout out Sysdig, sponsor of the podcast. I think their data at RSA was that 65% of developers are regularly vibe coding, and like you can't put brakes on that, right? Like if you're a software engineer, it's probably highly detrimental of your career not to be using, Claude Code or some of the other equivalents out there, and so. You have to find a way to make it work and make the risk appropriate for your organization. But if you say no, you're left with two options, which is you just become incredibly slow and left behind. All your top talent leaves, which is great news for me. And if you could send me that list of businesses that are not adopting AI, that would be great, because we'll happily find them the right home. Or you just end up with this entirely unstructured environment. And candidly, this is something that I didn't ever think I'd have to deal with in my own very small organization until I found out that like my team of 9 are just very unstructured around like what even is our policy, and what documents go where and what that means, and what safe means when you're using Claude, and the things that do and don't go in there. And it happens across organizations of all sizes. So it would be remiss of me to say to my team, who are not software engineers, but still like, hey, no AI, like, what are you talking about? Like that doesn't work anymore. So, okay, here's a matrix of red level green. This definitely doesn't go in. The yellow stuff, hey, let's get approval. Green is like, you're free to go. Because it is that is going to be the case across every organization. It's easy to manage in 9. And you've got 45 different entities within a wider organization. Absolutely. That comes with very different challenges, but the structure is no different.
And you made some really good points there, Stuart, that if you haven't taken a look at your company's information security policy, your acceptable use policy, are you using public version of Claude? Or are you only going to limit to internal Copilot versions of AI that's, an internal work? What is it that you're prepared to take at that risk? And again, that needs to be that board level decision. But absolutely training and awareness for those that are using it, what can go in, what can't go in. How do you manage that? How do you manage that? Oops, if something has got out into the wild.
Zero Signal is brought to you by Hampton North. I've been responsible for building and turning around cybersecurity programs for companies where a lapse in security just isn't an option. Finance, high tech, AI. Different domains, but the same truth. The programs live and die on talent. And no strategy ships without the right people who share the right DNA. That's why I partner with Hampton North. I've built 3 cybersecurity teams with them, and every time they move faster than anyone else without sacrificing quality. While other agencies are still pushing paperwork, Hampton North already had vetted candidates in front of me. Their executive search is not one size fits all. With one of the largest networks of security leaders in the US, their leadership roles hit the market in days, sometimes hours. And their go-to-market practice covers CROs, CMOs, revenue leaders, and full team build-outs for scaling cybersecurity businesses. They meet every candidate, they reference every story. If you're ready to build and scale and grow your security program, go to hamptonnorth.com and see why brands like Clear, Instacart, Airtable, and OpenAI trust Hampton North to build great teams. Check out the link in the description. I actually wanted to follow down that path a little bit more because you're absolutely right in this direction. So I want to transition us over to like, how do we, as CISOs, as security leaders, educate ourselves and meet the business like where they're at? Because if you actually look at that statistics, Stu, that you mentioned earlier, like 67 or 70% of engineers are using AI for coding, right? That's kind of a classic use case. Okay. But you could also see that in the same breath, less than 30% of the same organizations that are surveyed by, this data comes from Microsoft, have any sort of like monitoring or even blocking in place. So there is this massive. So I want to move us to like, how does security leaders meet this moment with a bit of humility? But like, what are some of the things that you're seeing that we could be offering to the business to help craft better solutions for adopting AI inside the enterprise?
So I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, this is a massive topic. We could carry on for hours discussing this, but I think that, you know, if you take anything away as a CISO, you need to think about how your role is changing. And your role is changing from that protection of infrastructure. And Stuart, I'm sure in some of those job descriptions that you'd have had as CISOs for maybe even 6 months ago, it'll be, you know, you need to protect the endpoints. You need to do this. You need to look at what the infrastructure is, make sure no data comes out. To actually now, it's a far more proactive view. I mean, I talk now with my clients about that threat-led proactive intelligence that comes into what they are doing. And that becomes into that governing of the intelligent systems and that adaptive system. So what worked yesterday for your governance, risk and compliance might not work today. And it's certainly not going to work tomorrow. And if we've got AI and agentic AI deployed in the environment, that's going to keep learning and tweaking and changing. And, you know, it needs guardrails as well. So I think there's sort of 5 things that as CISOs, we should begin to think about and question ourselves as to how we're working. The first is, what's our data risk policy? As you talked a little bit about that, you know, your red, amber, green, or, you know, how you're classifying your data. How can you make sure that the data that you have within your environment is held where it needs to be held and it's shared where it needs to be shared? If we think about some of our critical national infrastructure providers, both sides of the pond in the UK, US, anything that's, top secret, you would not expect that to go in. So your data classification and your data risk environments needs to be really understood, needs to be enforced, and you need to be testing that as well to make sure stuff is not getting out into the wild. Then when you've got those guardrails for those AI environments, that you've got that model risk. We talked about the duck earlier. What does my duck need to look like in an AI model risk? What's the bias I'm prepared to allow to come into my organization or not have? What do I need to look at for some of those hallucinations? Because we know as the regulations start coming down the line, we're going to have to, explain why, not only were we hallucinating, but why were our ducks hallucinating as well. We've got to be able to explain those issues. And we've got to look at what the new threat categories might be as they come in as well. So think about that security risk and think about some of those waves that are coming in, some of those deep fakes that frankly, some of the phishing scams and things that I've seen is very, very difficult to understand that actually is a deep fake. But also think about in that security risk, your supply chain. Because if you're unleashing in, Stuart, in your 9-employee organization, if you're unleashing the power of AI, what does that mean in your supply chain where you're relying on? And how can you make sure that the data risk and the model risk that you've got in your own environment is being employed by your third parties? It comes into understanding where your governance and your governance of the program or the project. You don't need 8 hours of IT risk meetings, thank goodness. But you do need to make sure that you've got that proactive ownership of that governance and thinking about, the use cases that you're prepared to actually let your employees or your third parties undertake on your behalf, and making sure those are documented. Because if they're documented in your governance reviews, you can look at that risk and you can understand that, yes, we were happy to have a purple dot with pink spots on. But equally, what we need to look at and keep on top of is some of that regulatory risk. And we mustn't lose sight of, both in the US and in the UK, there is that shift away from, just being able to go, I'm going to call it the Wild West, but, go freeform. We've got to make sure that, we've got things like NIST, which is, whilst in the US, it's, that voluntary, but almost widely adopted view of saying this is best practice and this is what we're looking at. And, look at in the UK around the GDPR, the implications of information that might get out around with GDPR as well. But equally look at what's coming down the line and what we might need to look at. In the UK, we've got a new cyber resiliency bill, which is around the digital way of working. That is going to, look at some of that AI way of working as well. So really looking at, what can we do with those permissions, with safeguards, so that we are being capable and also consciously competent when we're putting things into play. Now, again, Conor, one of the things that we saw with your presentation, RSA, and some of the other presentations, that 0 day to exploits. Mm-hmm. We're certainly seeing some of that 0 day to exploits being shrunk even more. I heard the other day 27 seconds from a vulnerability identified to when it's been exploited. That is just mind-blowing where we look at that. So, do we think that our current way of working as a CISO is the right way when we're trying to now protect everything, looking at that, governing that intelligence and that adaptive system? We need to think about not that mean time to detect or mean time to respond, but it's that mean time to adapt or to pivot or to do something differently or to act, because we are going to have to get our services and our solutions into that point where it can act as quickly as the adversaries are.
Can I just stop you there?
That was a very long answer.
Yeah,
that was a very long answer, wasn't it?
It's great. It's great. The last point to me, so you said that it has to change the way of thinking around how we approach some of these challenges and some of these situations. Does it change the profile of the CISO as a whole?
I think the CISO as a whole is we're a bit like chameleons. I think if we're talking to, the board, we're talking in what's the impact to the business. If we're talking into the technical teams, we've got to be able to talk that language. But yeah, absolutely. I think the role of the CISO is becoming far more of an evangelist and a thought leader about what might happen, and preparing an organization to pivot than some of the things of, what has happened. Now, don't get me wrong. Vulnerability management and that, age-old list of vulnerabilities that need to be patched and undertaken is even more important at this time, as we've seen with, Mythos and some of those exploitations. So we can't lose sight of that, core layer of business that the CISO needed to do. But the CISO has got to be able to pivot as well into a lot more than we have done in the past. And that doesn't mean shiny new tin either. I hate to put it out there for everyone who wants to go, ooh, new tin, thank you.
This segues us, I think, quite nicely to what we'd lined up as our next topic, actually. So you've led us perfectly, which is the CISO was made the expert, right? They were put in and said, okay, you go figure this out. Like, you're our internal SME. And the truth is, like, most CISOs actually did not, they signed up for the overall mission, which is to protect the organization. But if you were a CISO, let's say you've been in your seat for 6 years, like, that landscape has changed drastically. So, who is in charge of coaching and developing these CISOs and taking care of their learning journey? Because again, they've been thrust in the seat, and I speak to a lot of CISOs. There is no playbook. Well, the playbook is actually starting to come out, and shout out the Cloud Security Alliance for putting together some wonderful open source frameworks, but for the, I guess, the response to Mythos, but not really a playbook here. And everyone's been put in the seat to just figure this out.
Well, don't forget, also you're dropping into an organization, and no one organization is exactly the same as the other. So you've got that added complexity. You might have, I'm not going to say this is HSBC at all, but you might have old, large organization, legacy technology, like many of the banks and the financial institutions that we all do business with, the real, older banks and financial institutions. You might have that as part of your environment. But I can bet that if all three of us were CISOs in different organizations and we got together, I bet your environment would be different to my environment. It would be different to Conor's environment as well. So I think, you actually answer a really, really pertinent question. And the powerful CISOs, or the powerful sectors where CISOs are actually collaborating with those near misses, and that lessons learned from a near miss. If we were airlines, let's say I'm British Airways, Conor, you can be, I'm going to call you Virgin Airlines because that seemed like a good idea. And, you could just be the Wild West, Stuart. But if we've had a near miss, the Aviation Authority would call us in to say, okay, well, all three of you nearly landed at Austin Airport. What happened? You were all on the same runway. Why did that occur? We would unpick those near misses. And Simon Sinek talks about black box thinking. We don't often see enough of that black box near miss thinking in some of the sectors and some of the CISOs. So I can take that lessons learned. And that becomes, really, really powerful of, wish I'd known that 6 months ago because I'd have never gone down that route. I don't think it happens enough.
So that black box thinking, I really like that term. That black box thinking where it's people aren't sharing enough of the gory details of the near misses, of the pain and struggle, right? It's kind of the antithesis of the let me get on front of the stage, let me get on a paddle and tell you how good I am, how great I am. So,
I was actually going to ask you a question, Conor, which is, do you think there is an ego thing and there is that kind of peacocking syndrome? And I see this a decent amount, but there's a lot of people who claim to be far more proficient in AI than they actually are. And I know you speak to a lot of CISOs, have a tight community, Conor. Do you see a lot of chest puffing that may not actually exist?
I love this question. I'm going to catch it and I'm going to give it right back to Cheryl. So hold on, watch this. Watch this amazing segue that's going to happen here. Stu, this is a great question. So I am actually really interested in Cheryl's perspective on this because we're on this tightrope. We've got regulation coming out on one end, which says the CISO is personally liable if the organization has this, whether you are NIST 2, which is coming out, which is impacting our European counterparts. We've got DORA that's now present there in Europe. You've got the SEC. You've got that coming in for publicly traded companies in the US. The SEC's got more cyber regulations coming out soon around this. So there's like this personal liability that CISOs are starting to take on. So that disincentivizes them, is that a word, to get in front of everyone and say, hey, I don't have an answer. But in the same breath, it's like you also need to be an executive with like whose first reflex is humility, right? And honesty. And I would love, Cheryl, for you to tell me, how do you think we navigate that particular moment?
I think we have lots of different things that are at play. Firstly, sometimes you don't want to display that your organization might have had a weakness that you were aware of. And you're right, that personal liability, both, in globally is now becoming a real issue. That's why for some people, they don't want to step into the CISO role or the chief risk officer role or become a regulated person in a particular board as well, because it becomes that personal liability. But for some sectors, and there's a really great example of a sector here in the UK which I worked with, it would be about 10 years ago, the gambling sector. Sounds really strange, but the gambling sector, the CISOs in the gambling sector were one of the most collaborative and cooperative, because when there was a big event coming on, it might be the World Cup or the Masters or whatever, they would all get together in a room and share what they're seeing, because they have for the collective good, because they didn't want one or other of them to become a target. Now, I think we see it in some sectors. We do see it in some closed user groups. And I think having that closed user group, working under the Chatham House rules where, people can confidently talk about some of these things and know it won't get leaked out, that becomes a really good sharing environment. But looking at those, lessons learned of what's been unpicked and what could it have done, the what if type scenarios of red and blue and purple team testing is far more important to your organization than some of the other things that you might be thinking about. Now, don't get me wrong, you still need to do that staff training and awareness and no proactive view, but taking a what if type risk-based view of what if all of my data around my employees or my thing was exposed to Claude and it got out, what does that mean for us? That becomes the most important part. But Stuart, you talked about the training as well for CISOs. And I do think that sometimes we are so caught up in the role that we are doing that, there isn't time for training. We're just spending that time to catch up. We might get a bit of maybe a vendor training, goes, hey, look at this great product. Look what this can do. And you go, oh, gosh, right, okay, if I only had time to really get underneath and understand that. But actually, the soft skill training for a CISO is just as important as that technical training, because you might miss some of those signs of, the team around you where you've got burnout or you've got people who aren't functioning as they need to because, they don't understand some of the technologies that are coming down the line. And it is scary.
That's actually a really good point about making sure that we're, at the end of the day, the role of the leader is to lead and never get disconnected from the people that you're leading. Because as a security community, we can very easily get caught up in the technology aspect of it. But at the end of the day, you are a executive, a leader in the business, and you're leading people and growing a business. That's a really good grounding. And there's something else you said there. I just wanted to just kind of underline a little bit too, which is that mean time to adapt. You said that earlier. And as I was thinking about that phrase, I was like, one of the things that I've encouraged folks in the community to do, and I love to get your take on this too, is to start really grounding yourself in the data when it comes to the behavior of the threat actor. And the reason I say that is because for a very long time, I think security leaders could have grounded themselves in the data around compliance or governance or these industry frameworks. And if you understood that well and you understood your business, you could kind of pattern match and you could be like, okay, this is what I should do. But the threat actors are changing so quickly and they're adopting this new set of capabilities so quickly that actually the thing you need to be paying attention to the most is who's leading where the risk is, and the risk is where the threat actor is at. And using that, because if we can ground the hypothesis being, if you understand the threat actor, you would then be able to internalize what needs to happen for your business and you'd be ready to adapt to that. So I'd love to get your take on just that idea of, as a CISO and you're looking for a signal, one of the places to look for that is actually to start paying attention to threat actor activity more so now than you might have historically, say, 5 years ago before, or 4 years ago before the ChatGPT moment. Just want to get your reaction to that.
I think that certain organizations have been doing that for a long time. I think those that are thinking about it from a proactive, and there are some that have been thinking about proactive, some because they've been regulated to think about it from a proactive perspective. Let's think about our financial services organizations. They have to test that, adaptability. But I do think you make a brilliant point that, again, so very rarely do we actually take a view of what happens to an organization or an activity unless it's come out and there's been some massive, a thought process around it, and people have unpicked it and gone, this is what they did and this is how they pivoted. You've got to start thinking. Many of the police force and people who have been in the police force will say, to catch a criminal, you've got to think like a criminal. For us in the cyber industry, to catch an activist, we've got to think like an activist. And, we see these big exposures and these big threats or these big ransomware attacks and impacts getting some of those headlines. But actually what we need to be doing is coming back and saying, okay, so what does that mean for us? And what does that mean for our environment if that happened to us or one of our third parties? Because so many of these new regulations, Conor, you talked about NIST and NIST and DORA and GDPR and all of those things. If so many of our organizations now are so intrinsically embedded with suppliers and suppliers and suppliers that if one of those has an issue or an impact, that can have a big ripple effect onto us as well.
Totally. I mean, just look at software supply chain. I picked Shiloh Hood from 6 months ago.
Yep.
One compromised package, and now you've got 1,000 compromised packages ripple to the environment. That's just a great example, and you can have that happen at the software layer or inside the business relationship layer too.
And take that into, some of the things that we first started talking about, some of that AI environment as well. If you don't know your AI use cases, both in your own organization and your third party supplier organization, how can you then identify the data that might be impacted or the business impact or even that risk classification? You're in the dark, and, really spinning up a whole type of what if. And none of us as CISOs like being in that hot seat when there's an incident or an issue that's ongoing, because you are spending the time going, okay, well, what is this? And what do I need to do? And how am I going to work? And how do I see how things are working as well? So that's, the last thing we want is an incident to have to contain.
On the topic of things CISOs don't like, loads. But I think some things that they've historically, and I'm typecasting here, but huge transformation, right? I think CISOs like things to be steady so they can run their 3-year, 5-year playbook. We are in a period of huge transformation. And look, I think something you do well, which is probably why you're so successful in the consulting world, is you're very good at that people management, change management, kind of transformation programs. If you're a CISO and you're in that seat right now, like, what are some of the approaches and some of the strategies that you're bringing to the business that can drive them forward in this period of like ridiculous acceleration when it comes to transformation?
9 times out of 10, the reason why we as CISOs don't like the big transformation is it's gone through about 700 different reviews in different parts of the business. And they go, oh, we've forgotten security. Oh, damn. Well, they'll just get on board. And, it's like, well, if you brought us in at the start, we could look at what the risk impact is. So often cases, it has been very large transformations are being done for all the right reasons in an organization, but we've forgotten to bring all of the various parties along. It's much better now, particularly that security has a seat at the board level. And there's normally an executive from the board who will be responsible for that risk and that security risk as well. So we are getting better at bringing the security team along the way. But don't forget that many of us as CISOs are working from the cyber says no to the cyber says yes, maybe. We've got to play that overarching view of what the risk is, what the changes are going to be to the environment, and play catch up. So we're not always adverse to transformation, We are just spending a bit of time doing that. What does that mean? And that translation to our existing services, what might I need to do differently? And what might I need to change in the way of working or the way of measuring or the way of, determining that risk and controlling that risk as well. So don't get us wrong that we're not just CISO says no. The CISO is often playing catch up.
Can I take the other side of that too? So I'm like, Cheryl, I'd love your take on this too. Because when I talk to boards and I give updates, I often remind them that the CISOs are going through has this dual mandate, where what you're describing there, helping the business navigate its own transformation. And at the same time, we have to undergo our own transformation. And it's kind of a role that like most executives don't have. Most executives have to focus on their own organizational transformation to go from traditional to agentic. And that's it. But then the CISO has to come along and help support their peers at the same time they do their own transformation through that. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts or perspectives as it comes to a CISO going through their own transformation, moving from traditional processes to more agentic. Where are you seeing the more advanced security leaders leaning in on, or some of the patterns or mistakes that you might be seeing that they should be avoiding?
I'd say where I'm seeing the more successful security leaders lean in are those that are unafraid to ask questions. So why are we doing this? What's the objective? What's the change we're striving to do? Because asking those sort of curious type questions enables us to really understand where the business is coming from. And, as I said earlier, very often what's happening is that we're the last people in the series of teams that are being briefed on why the business is doing this. And we might have some of that biggest impact. I think the other thing that I would also encourage CISOs to look at is, where from your peer group or the organizations that you are following, they might be competitors, there might be someone in your sector, might be in a completely different sector. Where are you seeing those transformations occur? And what is it that you're saying has been doing well? And what is it, if you were in that role, you might do better? Now, I know that sometimes we don't have that luxury of being able to step back and just say, actually, what am I saying? But giving yourself just that 5-minute reflection, sit down in the morning with your coffee or whatever you do first thing in the morning as you're preparing, of course, we'll write our list of things we need to do, not because we're normally ending up looking at all those fires that we're fighting, but try and find just that 5 minutes of saying, what do we need to do differently? What do I need to go out and learn? Don't be afraid of saying to the business, I need to go and do some hands-on training. I need to go through and do, whether it's a SANS course or, Stuart, you mentioned about the cloud team. If you find somewhere where there is some training that you really want to do, go off and do that. Equally, I think, Conor, if I just, one bit that you mentioned earlier, which, the CISO's been brought in as that SME, the all-powerful SME, don't lose sight of the fact that in the team are people who have got much better experience some of these things. Just go and spend some time. For me, some of the best bits of times that I've found that I've learned the most is where I've gone to someone and said, look, I really would welcome some reverse mentoring. What do I need to know about your role that you are doing or your actions that you are taking? How can you help me to understand where I am and where perhaps some of my way of working is challenging and it's stopping the business? So humble and being able to come out and say, look, I don't know everything. That's why I have a team. That's why I have other experts that work for me.
That's incredibly good counsel. I love the fact that you're still, you're finding your peer group and you're making sure it's anchored towards your sector, because then you all have a shared vocabulary, understanding the priorities, likely have the same business pressures that you're going after. I think that's really good counsel. And I love this idea of the reverse mentorship. It's actually, you just said it. I'm like, I will keep that idea around for a while. So that and the yellow duck is my big takeaway. I love that though.
For me, my reverse mentoring relationships have probably been some of the most fundamental aha moments that I've had in my career. Yeah, well, we don't think about it like that in university, or we don't do it like that. So, okay, I'm going to have to change the way I work or the things that I do. But it's so good if you can do that and you can keep that open mind.
I also think you get respect as well. Like, I think it's, if you're looking at, you have like a 25-year-old security engineer in your team, and you're humble enough to say, hey, like, I need to learn more about AI red teaming or AI, governance as a code, et cetera. Like, there's so many things that it's 100% of their job and it's 2% of yours. Like, by theory, they actually should be better than than you are. But that's the best training you can get, right? Like, the reality is, and you get incredible buy-in. And it's funny, Conor does this, like, his lip goes up a little bit, and it's this like little smirk when he's like, I'm going to steal that. So I know for a fact that Conor has a library and his face is a tell. And I enjoy playing poker with Conor Sherman because of
sounds like one of us is called a poker player, the other is not.
But that's great. I love it.
The other thing that, I always think my role as a CISO almost is like the conductor of an orchestra. I've got all the various different parts of the orchestra, and the score has actually changed. The music's changed slightly. We're into that really tense moment. I need the percussions and the drums and the cymbals there because they're the experts for this particular part of what we need to do. And, no sooner if we got through that part of that incident and things are okay, we can go back to having the flute and it's all nice and calm and beautiful. But that definitely is, for me, it's the role of the CISO is to actually, dial up or dial back down the various parts and the roles that we have in the organization.
The infinite orchestra.
Yes, exactly.
I think that is a good place to wrap today's episode. Cheryl, thank you so much. You've had such incredible insights that you brought to the show here today.
It's been my pleasure.
Cheryl Martin is an executive at the C86, formerly the VP and head of cybersecurity at Capgemini in the UK. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show here today, Cheryl. We've really appreciated it. You've given me a lot to think about, and you're giving our audience a lot to learn. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If today's conversation gave you something useful, a framework, a question worth sitting with, a way to position something you're already dealing with, that's the point. Connect with Conor and I on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes. Tell us what landed.
And if you know another security leader who's navigating the same pressure, text them this episode. We'll see you next time.
Resonate.